Natural rights, the rights of man, human rights. The evolution of this political narrative centered around rights over the centuries has been incredible, and today discussion of rights is everywhere in our politics and our society. But how do constitutional rights, the rights that we lay down and guarantee in our constitutions, really work? Is it simply the case of the more rights the better, or should we try and focus on a few core rights that we can collectively enforce as a society? My guest today is Mila Versteeg, a professor of law at the University of Virginia. Her research argues that we need to draw evidence-based conclusions about the role of rights in our society and in our constitutions. I began by asking her about her background in political science and asking how this led to her interest in this particular topic.
My name is Mila Versteeg, and I'm a professor at the University of Virginia School of Law, where I also direct the Human Rights Program, and I teach comparative constitutional law, international human rights law, and so on. How did I become interested in studying constitutional rights violations? Well, obviously this is a really big, challenging research project that I've been interested in for some while, and the particular part of this research that I've been focusing on recently, which is, can we actually prevent human rights violations through law?
Mila's work consciously departs from much of the literature on constitutional rights by focusing on outcomes rather than ideals.
So the main research question I've been focusing on recently is, if we put certain rights in a constitution, does that actually improve rights outcomes in practice in some ways that we can measure? And then we're particularly interested in, does it actually change government behavior, right? So for example, if you put a right to healthcare in the constitution, do you see that the government makes a bigger effort in spending on healthcare? Or if you put a right to prohibition of torture in the constitution, does that actually lead to less torture on the part of the government? That's the broad question I'm interested in, and that I've been working on together with my co-author Adam Chilton, who's at the University of Chicago Law School.
Now, the most immediate question you might be asking yourself is, how exactly do we measure constitutional rights? Where do we get the data from? And what do we do with that data when we've got it?
So part of what I've done, and this was my dissertation project, is I've collected data on rights in constitutions over time. I would document, for example, whether a given constitution has the right to healthcare, and if there was an amendment, whether that changed, and in the next constitution, whether the same right was still there. So have this big database on constitutional rights. I mean, the other part of it is, how do we actually measure human rights violation? Violations is actually arguably more tricky. There's a big literature on that, but the most commonly used measures rely on the reporting by the U.S. State Department over time. So the U.S. embassies around the world, they report on different rights violations in countries.
So is there just one way of measuring constitutional rights? Does Law Economics provide us with some of the tools that we need to measure and to assess how constitutional rights are working?
This question that we're interested in, do constitutional rights actually matter? It's a difficult question to answer. So our approach is, you can't use a single method to answer the question. So one part of the research agenda is observational data. So we look at what do countries put in the constitution, and do we then actually see improvements in the de facto rights measures over time. But we've also done case studies for the book project that we're working on. So we did a case study on religious freedom in Russia, a case study on political party rights in Myanmar, a case study on free speech in Poland, one on union rights in Tunisia, and one in the right to healthcare in Colombia. So there's a case study component to this research. And then we've done some survey experiments. We did a big survey experiment in Turkey. And we've also done, we've interviewed experts from around the world. So so our view is, to get at a question as complicated as this, you can't use a single method, because there's no single method that can help you answer it. At the same time, the question is too important to walk away from just because there's no perfect method to answer it. So our approach is to, use all these different methods together.
So what are the findings of this research? If we measure how constitutional rights work in various different ways, what does this tell us about how we should be writing constitutions?
So one of the core findings in the research is, first of all, that writing rights in the Constitution doesn't necessarily matter. It's remarkably easy, often for governments to violate rights. Constitutional law is essentially directed at the state, right? So it's really hard to get the state to uphold these commitments because the government can decide to simply not follow the Constitution, and in many cases they do. Or in any case, if there's an unfavorable court ruling, they may not publish it, or may delay implementation. Or if the court has too many unfavorable rulings, they may just put new judges on the court, right? So it's really more difficult to enforce constitutions.
So the big question for Mila's research: should we be skeptical about all sorts of constitutional rights, or just some?
Some rights, when they are practiced within sort of organized groups, they are easier to enforce. So we say this is true for what we call organizational rights. So one example, for example, is the right to unionize. So the right to unionize is exercised by trade unions, and trade unions are well organized, and they're both have the incentives and the means to protect their interest against the government. The same is also true for religious freedom. So religious groups around the world tend to be really well organized. If there is some initiative that encroaches upon religious freedom, they will use the Constitution to mobilize and protect their interest. By contrast, if you give rights purely to individual citizens, this is more difficult, right? So citizens first have to care about human rights violations. Then they have to agree that certain government actions are actually too much, that they constitute constitutional violations to begin with. And then they have to do something, right? So they have to overcome a collective action problem. They have to decide, are we going to protest in the square? Are we going to change our vote in the next election? Are we going to litigate in court? But this is difficult, right? So we're saying for rights that are practiced on an individual basis, it's much harder to enforce them than rights that are practiced by organizations. Even organizational rights, like the right to religious freedom and so on, they're not a magic bullet. So at best, we're saying rights are speed bumps. They can slow a government down, but very determined governments are usually able to violate rights with some determination if they want to. So we're not telling a very optimistic story about constitutional rights overall. Many rights don't seem to make much of a difference, and the ones that do, at the best, they slow governments down. What you ultimately need to enforce constitutional rights is groups of citizens caring about violations and pushing very hard against the government, right? In some ways, we can think of a constitution as a social contract. It's a contract between the government and the citizens. And who ultimately has to enforce, the side of the contract against the government is the citizens themselves.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Center for Law and Economics video blog. If you want to find out anything more, look in the comments below or click subscribe.